that happens every year just about. If you go back and look, there's always seems to be some sort of attack or, some act of violence on Easter against, people who are attempting to celebrate, Jesus' resurrection. So keep those people in your prayers, keep their families in your prayers and their communities, because that's not just an attack against, those churches, but it's also an attack against the people of Sri Lanka in general. And they're all on note this morning with the tragic loss of life in that area. So let's pray for them and pray for them as they move forward, and they as a community try to get out, learn from this or grow from this in whatever way they can in the future. May we also take a moment then to realize that the Christian religion, the new covenant that Jesus established, has a very short but easy to understand saying, and that is, if you take up the sword, you're going to die by the sword. Right? John chapter 18, I think. Or is it Matthew 26? It's Matthew 26. When Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's talking to Peter, and Peter takes out his sword to defend Jesus from being arrested and put on the cross. And Jesus tells him, if you take up the sword, you'll die by the sword. Meaning that Christianity is inherently a religion of peace. It is one where we do not fight holy wars. We don't go to war to convert a nation or a people or whatever to Christianity. Instead, the weapons of our warfare are spiritual, attacking imaginations of the heart, and that includes systems of beliefs that inherently promote violence and spread all types of terror around the world. And so this is just another reminder or look that while maybe not everyone within the Islamic religion holds the views that the others do, just as views within Christianity differ. People act out in violence on behalf of Christianity, in times past. But that doesn't mean we all believe that way. So even though there are those within the religion of Islam who do not believe in these types of acts, there are some that do, and we need to speak out against that type of atrocity and recognize that the beliefs that those individuals have that would cause them to take another's life over a difference in opinion do come from a history of that type of action and come from the very book which they follow themselves. So this is a terrible loss of life, and it's not just brought about because of hatred, but it's also brought about because of religious confusion. And religious confusion leads to violence, not just of the physical kind, but also to the spiritual kind or mental kind. Just because someone believes in physical violence due to their religion doesn't make them necessarily worse than one who inflicts emotional violence or distress. So we need to be careful that we need to be careful that we learn from this tragedy that happens all the time to not weaponize our faith. That's different than trying to convert someone, but using faith as an excuse to harm someone else, whether it be physically or emotionally, is not acceptable under the new covenant. Okay, let's take a look at 1 Samuel 4. Jimmy.
By saying that, do you mean, and I remember when you and Jerry went to the seminar, that you both gave a day of your time to security in the church and everything.
Sure.
And you come back and shared some of it with us, and we've never done anything since then. Is that the reason we haven't?
Is what the reason we haven't?
What you just said about not weaponizing, that there was you brought back some suggestions of locking doors and possibly somebody being armed or several people being armed.
Sure.
And we've left it all away. And first of all, you guys spent a day to go there. I think
there's a difference between.
Okay, what's the reason then that we have not pursued it at all?
I don't know, but let me answer your question first. There's a difference between self-defense and actively going out seeking to harm someone because of a difference in faith. So that's not the same thing at all. Okay. I need my microphone on, Gary. Or can you try your hand at this? It's not popping on. Yes, there you go.
Bottom line, we can all sit here like people have done all over the country and the world and say it's not going to happen to us, but we don't know that.
That's true.
And when we know there's things we can do, it seems to me like we're not taking care of it.
Right. Perhaps we should have a meeting then of some sort to address those concerns.
Because we just let them lay.
Right.
And I'm sure there was a purpose that you and Gary spent a whole day to go there and learn all that.
I agree. But there is a difference between self-defense,
I get that.
yeah, and active violence. So. But that's a decision. Now it works better than you thought it would. That's a decision that that we have to make as a congregation. Okay, let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 4. 1 Samuel chapter 4. And like I said, we're going to go do an overview of now it's not working at all.
Fresh batteries.
They should be. They're inside the pack. Yeah, they're inside the pack that you had put up there.
Those things wear out.
All right, I'll do it like this for now, okay? So, in 1 Thessalonians 4 through 6, we hear of several military conquests from the nation of...
Give me that 2 more batteries. Let me try while you're teaching.
Okay, there you go. There's that thing.
Where's the battery?
The batteries were right here. We hear some military conflict between Israel and Philistine. So the Philistines, first off, they go to Israel and they fight and they defeat them pretty easily. If you look at verse 2, we see that they were able to kill about 4,000 of the Israelites on the battlefield. In verse 3, the people suggest a solution. He says, when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies." Now, what have they just done with the ark of the covenant? They've idolized it, haven't they? Their idea is, well, if we just bring this ark, then we'll be able to defeat the enemies. What did they not do? They did not ask God for assistance in this, did they? They trusted in a thing they trusted them. Good. They trusted them with They put their trust in an object rather than in their Creator. This is why moving from the Old Covenant to New Covenant was such a drastic change, if you will. They went from believing that they had to go to Jerusalem to be near the presence of God, when the New Covenant shows us now that we're always in the presence of God as His children. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we see this idea that existed in paganism, but even exists now in Israel, that things, that objects somehow will be able to deliver them from their enemies. Now, when the Ark of the Covenant came into the camp, verse 5, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth resounded. When the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, "What does the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. Now, the Philistines were afraid, and notice what they say in verse 7. For they said, "God has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who shall deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, or you will become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been slaves to you. Therefore be men and fight." Now, let's see what happens here. You have Israel on one hand, who is ecstatic because they brought the Ark of the Covenant into their camp. You have the Philistines, who are afraid of this, and they say, "Uh-oh, this means God's in the camp now," as if God wasn't in the camp already, you see. As if God doesn't always reside among his people. Not only this, they misidentify the nature of God. They say, "These are the gods who brought Israel out of Egypt," and etc., etc. So they didn't even notice or recognize Israel as being monotheistic or believing just in one God, but they thought this was a representation of multiple gods. So, verse 10, the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent, and the slaughter was very great, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. Not only was Israel defeated, but if you look at verse 11, the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. This is a tragic defeat for Israel, and this is a defeat that they find themselves in even after bringing the Ark of the Covenant into their camp. They put more faith in this ark than they did in God himself. Now, this can be translated over to today. Have you ever met somebody who has more faithfulness to the building than they do to God? Or someone who has more faith in, I'm going to say it this way, has more faith in the preachers in the brotherhood than they do God? They always talk about, well, brother so-and-so said, or brother what's-his-name said, and, well, I think we should believe this because, brother what's-his-name argued this way, instead of saying, well, what does God think? Are these men infallible? So we do this a lot of times in our society today.
Yeah,
Ashley?
I think that's why a lot of times people are so devastated when a preacher or whatever, falls or does something, outlandish, because they put these men on a pedestal, and not realizing that this is still a human being, a flawed human being that can and will make mistakes.
Right. One thing that is, I was thinking about the other day, talking to a friend about this. I've got a friend who's going through some interesting times at the church which he works for right now. Or the church for which he works, whichever. So right now, his elders, for instance, mentioned to him, now you're not going to preach an Easter sermon, are you, on Sunday? Because we don't want people to think that we're a Church of Christ that believes in Easter. So that...
We do that every Sunday.
Right. So that seems kind of strange. But the other thing that's happened to him is that they said, your lessons are too deep. We don't want you talking about the subject of the coming of the Lord anymore. And he said, okay, I'll make my lessons more light. So he made his lessons more light. You're just not giving us enough meat. You're just not giving us any meat. So he says, what do you want me to do? You tell me to do this, you tell me to do that. And so he says, they want meat, I'll give them meat. And they're starting 2 Corinthians this Wednesday, so I don't know what's going to happen with that. But anyways, I said, what's sad is they don't like it that you have a different opinion than they do. If a member of the congregation, let's just say Jimmy, just as an example. Let's say that Jimmy asked a question. He says, Daniel, I've got a friend who believes in using instrumental music in the worship service. And he said, he made this argument to me the other day, and I didn't really know how to answer it. And I'm not even sure, I don't even know what to think about that anymore. Can you help me deal with that? How many of us would judge him? Nobody, right? We would think, oh, wow, that's really good of Jimmy to be talking to his friends and asking questions and he's got some questions about it, and that's okay. We'll help him work through it, whatever. But let's say that I got up and I said, guys, I don't know. I've been studying this instrumental music problem here, and don't know how I feel about it. What would your response be? Boy, should he even be preaching here anymore? As if preachers don't have questions too, you see. And so the point of that was, what was the point? Oh, the point of it was, Ashley was talking about we put preachers on a pedestal. When really what we need to understand is that everybody is on their individual, nobody's perfect, everybody has questions, and everybody should be given the right to ask questions. Maybe not in certain scenarios at all times. We have to be prudent about that. But still, it seems like in church, in our recent church history, if the preacher has a question, instead of giving an answer or helping discuss it, more often than not, they're kicked out of the door, right? Have you seen that before? And so my friend who has these questions, instead of trying to answer the questions, they say, we don't want to hear it at all, hear no evil, see no evil, whatever, and we'll just pretend like it doesn't exist and look at all the problems that it's causing, because dialogue's not able to be not able to be had. But that's right. We idolize preachers from time to time, and because of that, when they mess up, we're shocked for some reason.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just this week in the news, we see where people idolize buildings, and even in the building, the crown of thorns was saved, and a piece of the cross was saved.
One other thing I saw is someone posted online. Seriously.
$1 billion in a week.
Seriously, they said in Nova Scotia when the cathedral, the cathedral burned, and I was worried about the Hunchback personally, but that's myself. But anyways, someone posted online, the Golden Cross was saved. What a miracle! That just shows you that God is real. I don't think that shows anybody that God is real or is not real. It's like the post that went around that somebody's, the house burned down and everybody in the house died, and they say, but the Bible was saved untouched on the nightstand. Doesn't that just shows you that God was there? Well, I think if God wanted to prove his existence in some trivial way as that, he would have spared, the family would have been spared. But when it comes to the building, here's my thoughts on the building. I think that historically and architecturally speaking, that was a tragic loss. But religiously speaking, I don't really care all that much. But historically and architecturally speaking, that's a pretty beautiful piece of artwork that showcases a time in human history where people were trying to figure things out. It's right around. You can put that in the same historical era as the Reformation movement. People are trying to move away from Catholicism, and it shows an interesting part of human history. But as for the religious significance of pieces of the cross and things as that, I don't really have much to say. That is until the cathedral in Canterbury, where they had, and this was before they found dinosaur bones, where they have pictures of dinosaurs on the thing. Now, if that one ever burns down, we'll have a different discussion. Okay, because that's pretty cool. But 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 12. Now a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came, behold, Eli was sitting on a seat by the road, eagerly watching. Hey, does that bring anything to your memory? The prodigal son's account, maybe, where the patriarch is waiting to see his sons arrive back. In this case, from war, because his heart, we say, verse 13, was trembling for what? For the ark of God. Now, let's put this into perspective. Here's a man whose 2 sons are in war. Potentially, he doesn't know their fate. They could potentially be dead. And what is he worried about? The Ark of the Covenant. Do we think that people in the Old Covenant may have had their priorities misplaced? Maybe. Just maybe, right? Like in the New Covenant, or in the New Testament, what's all the focus on? Seems like the temple of God. Okay. So the man, he sees in verse 13, so the man came to tell it in the city, and all the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, "What does the noise of this commotion mean?" Then the man came in hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. This happened to my granddad. He had the eyelids had formed in such a way to where it was causing him to be partially blind, and he had to get facial reconstruction. They cut this ear and they lifted it up. Oh, facelift. That's what they call it. That. And he looked like Frankenstein with a big, thing of stitches across his forehead for a couple weeks. But anyways, he's 98 years old. His eyes were set so that he could not see. The man said to Eli, verse 16, "I'm the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today." And he said, "How did things go, my son?" Then the one who brought the news replied, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people, and your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken." Now watch this in verse 18. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was old and heavy. Thus he judged Israel 40 years. So Eli was crushed under his own weight. And that's how he lost his life. But just notice how odd this is. It wasn't when he mentioned that his sons had died, but it was when he mentioned that the ark of the covenant had been taken. That's when he fell off his seat. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Now this could have been because Samuel had prophesied just a chapter before this what would happen to his sons. So maybe he wasn't surprised by that. Maybe he kind of expected that to take place. But it just still, it's just shocking to me that what he's most concerned about is the Ark of the Covenant and not about the well-being of his sons or the 30,000 men that died at the hands of the Philistines. That's okay, I guess, as long as the Ark of the Covenant makes it back, at least from the standpoint of Eli. At least that's how he's behaving in this chapter. Okay, let's look down to verse 19 to 22, because this reflects another interesting attitude that the Israel had towards the Ark of the Covenant. So, now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' his wife, was pregnant and about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the Ark of God was taken and that her father-in-law and husband had died, she kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman who stood by her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you've given birth to a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. Let me talk a little bit about that for a second. This goes back to the inheritance laws. Okay, so if the brothers have died, and if the father has died, then who's going to carry on the name of the family? Nobody, apparently. But she has a son, and so the name of the family can still continue on. But she's in so much grief that she did not even answer or pay attention. And she called the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," which Ichabod means no glory, because the ark of God was taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken." They see this as God departing their presence, as if God was no longer among his people. We learn from Israel's history over and over again. The kings sin, the people are losing wars, they're taken into captivity, and yet God always says, "I'm going to retain a remnant of my people who've not yet forsaken my name, because I have some promises that I need to fulfill to Abraham, then later, of course, to David." So in this chapter, she fails to see how God actually behaves. She views this Ark of the Covenant leaving the people as if God was no longer among the people, as if God still didn't have a plan for the people, as if there was no end goal from all this. And so she says the glory has departed from Israel. Robert?
Didn't that in some way speak to how we view the cross today? Some people just believe that the cross is the identity of God, and we are living in a tangible world, and we need tangible things sometimes. And I think that was the same mindset going about the ark itself, how sacred it was, and they needed something to
Right. So that is true. Sometimes we can almost idolize objects, but at the same time, though, I'm going to take this into a secular example. Having an object to remember someone by is not inherently a bad thing. It can become a bad thing in religious ways if you begin to idolize it. But how many of us have ever carried a note from our mother in our wallet, or carried an icon? Maybe your son is at the beach and he comes up to you and he says, Dad, I found this rock. And it's just a rock, but you keep it in your pocket, for the next 20 years or whatever the situation might be. Or someone gives you a watch. So things, physical objects to remember someone by are not necessarily bad things. When we come into the Christian world, we have several things that are physical that represent spiritual things. For example, Lord's Supper. That is one thing. But can the Lord's Supper become idolatrous to us? For someone, it might be able to. I don't want to, judge every single person that believes this way, but the idea of transubstantiation, that the emblems that we take literally become the body and blood of Jesus, may be an indication of that, as if you have a part of the divine going down your, esophagus or whatever. But the act of baptism as well is a physical act that we use to represent one's spiritual rebirth, so to speak, becoming a new creature, being born of water and spirit. Now, all of these things, Keith?
You cannot look at the history of Israel and look at how the ark came about and not realize the importance to Israel with the other ark. The ark was, and I understand you saying about different things, but the ark was created by, God gave the instructions on how the ark was supposed to be created, even to the point of how the ark is supposed to be moved and how it's supposed to be positioned and what it was supposed to do. It was a symbol to Israel, as long as it was amongst them, that God was with them. Not necessarily that he was physically present all the time, but that they were entering into a covenant with him and that he was there. So when the ark was taken, it was like that covenant or that agreement was, or that protection was gone. And this is why Israel was so upset about that, and they felt like the glory of Israel was departed, because they looked at that ark as a symbol that God was present with them, and that if God was present with them, they could defeat anybody. Nobody could stand against them.
All right, but they didn't. They still lost, even though the ark was among them.
But they didn't lose the whole. They lost battles. That's what I'm saying. They lost battles, yes, and it was because they sinned.
Right.
When they corrected their sins, God restored them, and no nation stood against Israel.
That's true.
So,
there was nothing wrong with the Ark of the Covenant within and of itself, but they had begun to idolize it in such a way.
Yeah, it's hard to see how they could not somewhat idolize the ark in how they received it. I mean, they received it in such a kind of a holy kind of way. I mean,
sure.
When you're talking about the ark, that was part of the covenant. I mean, the tabernacle and all the things with it. It had a significant spiritual meaning to that nation. And so as long as they saw the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Lord was with them, they weren't afraid of anything. They wasn't, they assumed that God was with them and they could defeat anybody.
Right. That's what they assumed, right?
Yeah,
At least.
But sin cancels a lot of that stuff out. And we do the same thing, in our life, we assume that if we living right and doing the things that God has told us to do, that nobody can stand against us. That we will eventually win the battle. But if we incorporate sin into our daily life, then that creates a separation and a problem, and we can be defeated. We are defeated in life a lot of times when we sin. So I mean, Israel is not, as the brother says, not so far from us. We do a lot of the things that Israel do, and
For sure. We'll talk about one in a second about that. But
Sure.
yeah, that's right. With Israel, so what they had done is they had taken the ark and the temple and the lampstands and the showbread, and they turned it into something that it was never meant to be originally. And let me ask you this though: in Israel, there was always a remnant, right? A remnant of individuals who were faithful to God always existed in Israel. From the time of the creation of the Old Covenant, you have Joshua and Caleb, up to the time of Christ. Paul said in Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11 that a remnant has always remained. There's always been faithful. So, in BC, in 606 BC to 586 BC, when the temple of God was destroyed, and thus the presence of God was no longer in the most holy place, and the Ark of the Covenant was taken away. We don't see that anymore after that. What about the remnant? Was the presence of God still with the remnant of the people? In this case, with the Ark of the Covenant being gone out of the camp into the hands of the Philistines, had the glory of the Lord departed from the remnant of the people? See, I think that the ark and the temple were there to symbolize something, but their presence or absence did not determine whether or not God himself was present or absent with his people.
But it stood as a reminder to the people
Yes,
that when they sin, there are consequences to the act.
of course.
And God, in removing the ark from them, I won't say got their attention, let them know that they were in sin, that they did not please God.
Right.
That's the reason that the ark was taken away from them. Same when God got ready to remove the temple. I mean, Israel wholesale rejected Christ, right? And the temple was taken away from them.
That's right.
But not only the temple was taken away from them, but the old law was moved out the way because of that. And it was totally destroyed, taken away. And all the things that are similar of the Old Testament or the Old Covenant was removed. You talked about the ark. You don't see or hear anything else about the ark. It was removed out because that was a part of the old law.
Right.
The temple represented the old law, represented God being with his people and so forth. So those things were moved out, but it was moved out the way to, as you said, the remnant to establish a new covenant for those that were faithful. But it still stood as a symbol to the people. They all understood once the temple was destroyed, that God was not, because of sin, they didn't have that perfect union with God as they assumed. If you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Every time they did something, they backslid into sin. There was a consequence for their sin, and a lot of times it was not only that God, it was something like really dramatic, and in this case, the removing of the temple was really, 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 really dramatic to them. They understood that they had sinned and they were not in the graces of God.
That's right. Johnny, then Robert, and then I'll say one final thing.
Robert, maybe, if he pertains to that, just something different, I want to ask a question.
Okay. Robert?
I was just going to say, I agree, it really is kind of difficult of the heart. And to say that someone would take it too far in their day would probably be almost, in my mind, the way impossible. They had seen things that came through that heart. They've been given instructions. They've seen people be killed just touching it. So it was more than what we probably could even imagine in our minds when you talk about the heart and
That's fair. Johnny?
If that's finished on that, it's just verse 20. I'm getting somewhat confused on that. And about the time of her death,
Okay.
I mean, she passed away.
She passed away giving birth, or shortly after giving birth.
Shortly after.
Right, so it looks like about the time of her death, the woman who stood by her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son." So she died shortly after giving birth to Ichabod here. Okay, let me say one thing about how sometimes the symbols that we have can turn into borderline idolatrous things. We have the Lord's Supper before us, and a lot of people in our world today show up to worship services to get the checklist done. You show up, and as long as you sing, pray, preach, take the Lord's Supper, and you put some money into the collection plate, that's you're checking off your ticket, your itinerary to get into heaven. And the Christian life, though, demands more than just taking of an emblem, but it's what that emblem means to you and how that radically transforms your life. That's more about what it's about. The same thing can be said of baptism. Whenever a 7 or 8 year old, can we really say that 7 or 8 year olds understand sin and understand their relationship with God? Maybe you have, some 7 year old who's extraordinarily mature or really smart or something like that. But when a 7 year old is scared to death of going to hell because he has, he didn't obey his teacher one time or something like that, or didn't obey his parents, and you have a 7 year old who is asking to be baptized, it seems like more teaching is done on the necessity of being baptized than on why baptism would be necessary in the first place, you see. So I think we are all in danger of potentially taking things that God has given us and turn them into something that's not helpful. For example, let me do another one here. Have you ever, now I know that all of us here have different Bible translations. I know we have NIV and NLT, and I'm not sure what Keith has on his device there. Is that King James or King James? And what do you have, Jaden? The ESV, and I know CSV. Oh, and Laura uses the ESV, and I use New American Standard. Okay. Well, there's some congregations where you cannot use, it's not that it's suggested that you should use, but you cannot use anything else but American Standard, or you cannot use anything else but King James Version. And if you use anything else, it's almost as if you're reading out of the Quran, Now, is there some potentially, idolization going on there? So here's the thing I have nothing against using most versions that I'm familiar with. There's some that obviously are just way out there, or were made for a specific purpose to push a particular doctrine. But the King James Version and they translated the Apocrypha as well. And so there are 48 men working on that, 8 of them on each section that they split up. And every single one of those men were higher ups in the Anglican Church. And I had somebody tell me, and again, that's not anything against it. I mean, I'm sure New American Standard was translated in quite the same way. But I had someone tell me, why don't you use the King James? Don't you know that that's, God's authorized version? And I said, well, I'm not an Anglican, so why would I do that? But do you see how those individuals might be idolizing a particular version of the Bible or something like that? So this is a danger any of us can fall into, so we need to be careful of doing something like that. All right, we'll stop here, and that was a good overview of those 3 chapters, wasn't it? I think we got through one, so